So in this section, I'm going to talk about On the Waterfront and High Noon, two movies that have very similar issues. Ideally, it'd be great if everyone watched all four, but I realize like having you watch three movies in a week is a lot, and four would just be crazy. So that's why I put High Noon as an extra credit, even though I will again be talking about it. Um, and for my discussion on the waterfront. I'm going to give you quite a bit of background information because I think understanding the historical context of On the Waterfront is really important to understanding the movie itself, much more so than in any of the other movies we've seen thus far. On the Waterfront is directed by Elia Kazan, and Elia Kazan is a fairly controversial figure for reasons I'll explain in a little bit. Think about what this movie is really about, right? So on the surface, it's about what these longshoremen are going through, and the fact that it's run by this corrupt mafia. Um, and Terry, Marlon Brando's character, is sort of working for the mafia. He benefits from the corruption. Then comes Father Barry and the character of Edie, played by Eve Marie Saint. And these two characters would be, again, what in the era of the production code, they would be known as compensating moral value, right? These are the characters who say, this is right and this is wrong. And of course, Marlon Brando, or Terry, as the main character, is conflicted. That he feels he owes a certain kind of allegiance, a certain loyalty to the mob, but at the same time, he knows that what he's doing is wrong, right? And Edie is like the sort of the voice of the social conscious, telling him that he needs to sort of stand up and do what's right. And in this case, doing what's right is going and testifying in court as to the corruption. In other words, he has to be a stool pigeon. And even though his testimony is going to benefit all these dock workers who are sort of screwed over because of this corruption, even though Terry's testimony is going to help them, they turn their backs on him. They don't want anything to do with him because he's essentially a stool pigeon, right? So as bad as the corruption is, there's this kind of code that you don't sort of rat on other people. And when you look at the movie On the Waterfront in this way, there's something very old-fashioned about it, especially when you compare it to something like The Hustler or The Apartment. And specifically, what I'm talking about here is a lack of moral ambiguity, that in On the Waterfront, good and evil are clearly separated. That evil comes from the mob and the corruption that exists in the docks. The good comes from Edie and the priest, right, who are sort of moral authorities, right? These people again are compensating moral value. Now Terry is kind of stuck in the middle there, but he's stuck in the middle again between two very clear places of good and bad, and this in many ways falls in line with traditional old Hollywood, the golden age of Hollywood, and of course the golden age of the production code. There is nothing kind of new or modern about this movie. And this is really important. This isn't just an accident. This isn't Elia Kazan, being an old-fashioned fuddy-duddy, because he's not. He's actually a very innovative director. The reason this movie has this kind of old-fashioned sense of moral values is because this movie and the director Elia Kazan was embroiled in the sort of great political environment of the time, and namely what today we call the Red Scare, that is, the hunt for potential communists in America. And specifically, there was this thing called HUAC, H-U-A-C, which stands for the House on Un-American Activities Committee. And, the job of HUAC was to sort of find out who the communists were, in terms of government employees. That's where it started, and then it started spreading to sort of trying to find communists everywhere, including in Hollywood. And a lot of people in Hollywood refused to testify. And if you refused to testify, you were blackballed, which meant you couldn't work in Hollywood. And there are some people, though, of course, who cooperated. And Elia Kazan was one of those people who cooperated. In other words, Elia Kazan, like Terry, was a stool pigeon. He sort of ratted out to the government, people that he knew, people who he associated with that were sort of under suspicion of being communists. And this here, of course, is a picture of Joseph McCarthy, the senator from Wisconsin, who was responsible for really stirring the pot in terms of creating this kind of red menace, this communist scare. Now, Elia Kazan was not the only person in Hollywood who went and testified before HUAC, but he was definitely the most prominent. He was the most well-known. Most of the other people from Hollywood who had cooperated with the government were much sort of smaller players, right? So when Elia Kazan testified, it was considered a big deal that a lot of the Hollywood establishment, a lot of the bigger stars, had basically refused, and again, many of them lost their jobs and lost their careers. Well, Elia Kazan used to be friends with a famous playwright named Arthur Miller, and basically this whole brouhaha over Kazan's testimony basically ended their friendship, destroyed their friendship. And in fact, Arthur Miller went on to write a play called The Crucible. And The Crucible is about the Salem witch hunts, in which a group of young girls basically started this whole paranoia that these witches were haunting Salem, and that the leaders of this community started all these trials, and this all actually happened. I mean, this is a real part of early American history, and many people were killed or executed because they were thought to be witches. And the way they were sort of found out was simply someone had accused them, right? It was a bunch of people ratting out other people in trying to sort of, get these witches. And of course, we know now through historical documentation that a lot of times people were accused of being witches just because they weren't liked by someone else, or a prominent business person wanted another person's piece of land and they would accuse them of being witches. It was this terrible period in American history. And Arthur Miller basically sees the communist trials, the communist scare, as being kind of a modern version of the witch hunt. And he was incensed that his friend Elia Kazan would cooperate. And so he wrote The Crucible. So that On the Waterfront then becomes Kazan's response, saying, well, look, going out and testifying is not a witch hunt, it's simply kind of the right and moral thing to do. And here's sort of one of the posters for On the Waterfront. And this design is very specific. Notice how the oppressive mob boss here in the background is all painted in red. And this was sort of to evoke this idea of communism. Again, the way communism was going to destroy America is parallel to the way the mob is destroying this waterfront. And Marlon Brando's character Terry, again, is simply doing the right thing. This controversy, unfortunately, never left Kazan. And even after it was all over, there are many people in Hollywood who refused to associate with him. Kazan made a few more films, but he sort of really fell out of favor. Now, in the 1990s, he was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Academy, the guys who do the Oscars. And there are many people in Hollywood who were very upset that Kazan was going to receive this Lifetime Achievement Award. He was never forgiven for his cooperation with the government. And so when he went up to get his award, when he was given his award, you could see in the audience of the Academy Awards that there were a lot of people who refused to stand up and basically just sat on their hands, refusing to clap. There's a very sizable number of people who did this. So even today, despite the fact that Kazan is no longer with us, there's still kind of a taint to his name, a taint to his legacy that, in my opinion, will probably last forever, last as long as people remember the communist witch hunts of the 1950s. Now, on the surface, High Noon and On the Waterfront might appear to have very similar plots, very similar ideas, insofar as both movies are about how society turns its back on evil, right? And On the Waterfront, there's this corrupt mafia mob that runs the waterfront, and no one likes it, but no one wants to do anything. No one refuses to cooperate with the police, except for, again, Terry. Terry's the lone guy who kind of fights against evil, right? Pretty much by himself. High Noon seems to present the same thing. It's about a gang of people coming into town, and no one is willing to help, right? I mean, very quickly, for those of you who did not do the extra credit and did not watch High Noon, I mean, the basic plot is this, that Will Kane is this sheriff who's just retiring, and he just married this Quaker woman. And Quakers are infamous for being pacifists. Anytime during a war when there was a draft, Quakers would always remove themselves from the draft. It's against their religion to fight at all. So Will Kane is a sheriff who's retiring, marries a Quaker, and he's about to head off on his honeymoon. And right as he's leaving, he gets word that this guy, Frank Miller, has just been released from jail. It's been reported that Frank Miller's gang, in fact, are waiting for him at the train station, and the train is going to arrive at noon, and that's why the movie is called High Noon. And so, of course, everyone's expecting that when Frank Miller and his gang get back together, they will sort of come into town and they'll destroy the town because they're all seeking revenge on the sheriff, Will Kane. Okay, so that's basically the setup of the movie. And Will Kane decides that he wants to, stick it out. He's not going to go on his honeymoon. In fact, he wants to stay and defend his town. And initially, people are like, "Yeah, we like you, Will Kane. You're a great guy, and all this stuff." But slowly, when things start to get real, when the threat becomes real, people start finding excuses not to help. The few people who are willing to help, when they realize not enough people are coming, they chicken out. And essentially then, Will Kane is left by himself. He's completely isolated from the rest of the community. No one is willing to help him in this kind of great moment of crisis. The town has completely abandoned him. But now here's the big difference between High Noon and On the Waterfront. In High Noon, or in On the Waterfront, the evil, the sort of corrupt mafia, the mob, is seen as a metaphor for communism, right? And Terry is doing the right thing by snitching, by being a stool pigeon, by telling the authorities what they need to know. In the case of High Noon, however, most critics have sort of seen the battle between good and evil here in just the opposite terms, right? That instead of sort of the good being the government and evil being communism, in this case, the evil is the government. It's the thing that's terrorizing the people, which is Senator McCarthy's trials against communism. HUAC, right? HUAC, House on Un-American Activities Committee. That this government entity is terrorizing Americans by conducting this witch hunt against communists. And the reason it's allowed to happen, the reason that someone like McCarthy is allowed to sort of throw around these crazy allegations, 99% of them turned out to be lies. The reason this happens is because people just don't care. People are apathetic. People are only looking out for their own immediate interests, right? They don't care what happens to society. They only care what happens to their individual self. And in this way, then, Americans, the community, they're so much seen as being unpatriotic because they don't care what happens to America, just as the townspeople here don't really care what happens to the town. So, as might be clear then from not only my discussion of these two movies, but also my discussion of The Apartment and The Hustler, the 1950s is a time when Hollywood is really starting to kind of grow up. There is a maturity to their films, to their themes. this is why I titled this week's topic as, Hollywood grows up or Hollywood gets serious, because there is, again, a certain depth to these films. And I'm not saying that there weren't serious films made in Hollywood before this, because they certainly were, but they didn't have the same level of complexity, ethical complexity, story complexity. That this really is kind of the beginnings of a modern Hollywood sensibility. And I think we can trace this back to Orson Welles and Citizen Kane. That's the movie that allows all these other things to happen. And so one of the things that, I talked about the Paramount Decree and how that decree ended the studio system. Well, in much the same way, like what was happening in Hollywood in the 1950s would eventually result in the end of the production code, right? That, movies were getting increasingly more complex. The ethical issues were more complex. There was the beginnings of a new kind of gritty realism. In addition, method acting, that actors were sort of digging deep into the psychology of characters and really sort of, figuring out what makes characters tick. And sometimes that required, again, a certain emotional complexity that just wasn't compatible with the kind of simple, black and white rules of the Hollywood production code. All right, then. So I think I'll end it here, and best of luck and take care.